Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affections towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him in all the ways that he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and today we're going to talk about our culture's strange relationship with food and physical health. In fact, the important question I wanted to tackle today is Snickers or Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. And not just which one is better, because I think both of these are pretty great. I'm going to go with the Reese's for a moment. So the question is not, does this taste good? Because we all know that it does. The question is, as a Christian, should I eat this? I mean, it's not good for me. It's clearly unhealthy food, and my body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. But maybe eating just these two cups is okay. But how many would I need to eat before it's gluttony, or before it's sin, or before it's obsession? We have in our culture a weird relationship with food and physical health, because on the one hand, we live in this rare experience where we have so much that we have the opportunity to eat to excess and get really, really overweight and eat to the point of either obsession or addiction or just getting really, really unhealthy. So on the one hand, we have that dynamic in our culture where we can all get very, very overweight. The other dynamic that we have in our culture is that many people prize the idea of physical health and especially eating well to the point of making it a core value or a core virtue of our culture. That it's not simply that you're unhealthy if you're overweight, but you're just sort of a bad person. And so we need to have a renovation in school lunches and make sure that we're feeding our kids only really healthy foods, and we need to avoid certain supplements and glucose, corn syrup, whatever stuff is just as bad as showing your kids R-rated movies. I don't know. We have a strange relationship with food in our culture and with physical health. And so the question to bring to this is, from a Christian perspective, what is to be our relationship with physical health? Some people will ask the question, do we in churches need to be talking about gluttony more because we talk about other sins? So is this one that we just kind of conveniently avoid because we think it's not okay to be sexually active outside of marriage, but it is okay to be fat? So we're just going to kind of avoid that and not talk about that sin. Do we need to talk about this more? Do we need to just shrug our shoulders to this? What is the Christian perspective towards food and physical health? So the way that I want to talk about it is kind of through a progression, and to start with saying a lot of what is in the Bible when it comes to the idea of food are things that are found in the Old Testament, and they relate to the whole idea of dietary restrictions. If you read the Old Testament, you'll be aware of this. There were all kinds of things that the Israelites were not supposed to eat, foods that God had forbidden in a dietary code. Now, the important thing to realize about this wasn't primarily, or at least it's very hard to demonstrate, that the reason why God was calling them to avoid certain foods was because of prizing their physical health. In some of the cases, you could make the argument that this would have been, bad for their health, or they didn't have right cleanliness procedures, so that's why they weren't supposed to eat these things. But the consistent refrain when they're told not to eat these foods is not, don't eat that, it'll go straight to your hips. It was, don't eat that, God has said not to eat it. And you, the Jews, are a unique people. You're meant to stand out. You're meant to be different than the other nations around you. And some of the things that you do that are different are just to be different, just to point out to the people that you have different practices so that they can be curious about you and curious about the God that you serve. So when we read the Old Testament, it's not simply the idea that they're supposed to eat healthy. It's that they're eating differently. In fact, some people look at the book of Daniel, and especially Daniel 1, and point towards that as an example of how it's really important to God that we eat very healthy. So here's what happens in Daniel 1, and maybe a little bit of myth busting here if you've heard about this idea that Daniel decided not to eat meat, but to eat only vegetables, and he got really healthy by eating only vegetables, and so this just goes to show you that you don't need meat, and an all-vegetable diet is a really healthy way to go. In fact, there were some people that came up with what they called the Alleluia diet, or the Daniel diet, based on this idea of Daniel 1. Well, here's what's actually going on in Daniel 1. Daniel and other young Jewish men are taken off into exile to Babylon. And when they arrive in Babylon, they're being groomed for people who can serve the king. And as they're being groomed, they want to fatten them up. They want to get them nice and healthy, because when you're a refugee, you're usually not real healthy or energetic. And so they're going to feed them all this food. And Daniel and his Jewish friends decide, we don't want to eat this food because the vessels that it's been prepared in and the vessels that it's being served on are not ceremonially clean. This would violate our consciences and violate our cleanliness codes as Jewish people. And so Daniel goes to the guy who's in charge of all this and says, let's make a deal. We don't want to eat this, so for the time being, just serve us vegetables that haven't been tainted or prepared in any ways by these unclean vessels. Just serve us the vegetables. And if in a month or so we're not more healthy and more energetic, and he even says, and fatter than all of the others, then you can pull the plug on this and we'll do what you say. And in the end, it turns out that Daniel and his friends are more healthy and they've gained more weight and they're more energetic than all of the others. This was not a tribute to good, clean living and eating the right foods and eating only vegetables. This was a tribute to God doing something miraculous for a group of young men that were looking to keep themselves ceremonially clean. So when we read through the Old Testament, don't think health, think staying ceremonially clean, being different because God has called us to be different. Now, when you move into the New Testament, those food laws are abolished. Or the better way to say it is, those food laws are fulfilled. Because in Matthew 15, Jesus says, all foods are now clean because we're no longer cleansed by how we handle those things. We're cleansed by Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the dietary laws because he's the one who ultimately makes us clean. Something similar happens in Acts chapter 10 when Jesus appears to Simon Peter in a dream and tells him, go ahead and eat these unclean foods because don't call anything unclean that I've called clean. And ultimately, that's about Peter being prepared to go and talk to the Gentiles about the gospel of Jesus. But it also is pointing towards this idea that the dietary laws served their purpose. And then they were fulfilled. And so if you read all kinds of passages, whether it's Romans 14 or whether it's 1 Timothy 4, you come across the consistent refrain that food is no longer something that we're judged by. If somebody wants to follow the Jewish dietary laws, that's fine. If somebody doesn't, that's fine. It's all okay. In fact, most of the warnings that were given in the New Testament are not about overeating. They're about beware of people that say you're not supposed to eat certain things because that's a false doctrine. So that's our starting point. Moving from there, I want to get into kind of the whole subject about gluttony and again about the whole idea. All right, so if we're not bound by the dietary laws of the Old Testament, which we're not, Jesus clearly said that we're not, what role does physical health play in our lives? And I already mentioned it at the beginning of this episode, but the whole idea of gluttony, if you saw the movie Seven, which I'm not saying everybody should go see, but if you saw the movie Seven, or if you're just aware of the 7 deadly sins, gluttony's on that list. So gluttony's a really big deal, right? Gluttony's this core Christian sin that we seem to ignore all the time. Well, let me just talk about gluttony for a minute. Gluttony does, or the word glutton does show up in 6 passages in the Bible. So 6. That's not a ton when you think of all the other things that are mentioned, but there's 6 passages that talk about gluttony. Now, I'm going to just mention those real quick, and then I'm going to talk about the bigger concept of gluttony. But in these 6 passages about gluttony, 3 of which come from the book of Proverbs, you start to see a trend of what gluttony may be. Now, of these 6 passages, 3 of them, when glutton is mentioned, the idea of a glutton is paralleled with a drunkard. Gluttons and drunkards, they just go hand in hand. So it's not saying somebody that eats some food and somebody that drinks a little alcohol. It's somebody that eats clearly to the point of excess and somebody that drinks to the point of excess. So glutton and the idea of drunkard are paralleled. In one of the other passages, the idea of being a glutton and being lazy is paralleled. And another one, being a glutton and being undiscerning, is paralleled. What you see when you look through these passages is that the idea of a glutton is not simply somebody that eats too much food or has gained too much weight. I mean, just even think about it for a second. With most of the sins that are talked about in the Bible, we know whether or not we've done them. You know whether or not you've committed adultery. You know whether or not you've lied to someone. You know whether or not you've murdered someone. We can tell whether or not we've done these things. But with gluttony, the reason why I asked the question at the beginning to say is eating one of these gluttony? 2, 3, all right, is being 5 pounds overweight by how we define it in our country, is that gluttony? 10 pounds overweight? Is it 50 pounds overweight? At what point are we a glutton? Now, there's a quote by Kevin DeYoung that I'm going to read in a moment, because Kevin DeYoung had a book, and it was called "What Does the Bible Really Teach About Homosexuality?" And one of the things that he did in the book was he talked about the fact that some people will say, well, Christians talk a lot about how homosexual acts of sin are wrong, but they won't talk about gluttony. This is picking and choosing. And he has a really helpful comment on it in light of the fact that when gluttony is talked about in these biblical passages, the picture that we get is not just somebody that ate too much food and got a little bit fat. The idea is somebody who is a wild partier. Glutton goes along with drunkenness and irresponsibility and laziness and being an overall person who is not concerned with God's will. So here's what Kevin DeYoung says. He says, so what does the sin of gluttony look like? When we take the time to open our Bibles and read the relevant passages, we find that gluttony is much more than eating an entire bag of double-stuffed Oreos, or for me, Cool Ranch Doritos. Choose your one. He says, partaking in food is much less of a concern than partaking in sexual sin. And he cites 1 Corinthians 6, verse 13, which I'm going to read in just a little while. He goes on to say, the composite picture from the passages above suggests that a glutton is a loafer, a partier, and a profligate. He's the prodigal son wasting his life on riotous living. She's the girl on spring break who thinks the pinnacle of human existence is to eat, drink, and hook up. A wastrel living for the weekend, a big city high flyer who cares for nothing except that he might indulge in high society, a ne'er-do-well who takes lifestyle cues from the Hangover franchise. The idea of a glutton is not just somebody who ate too much or gained too much weight. It's somebody who spends their life on excess, who is ignoring God and about wild partying. So for that question, if we said, should we in the church be talking about gluttony more? The answer is, well, if we understand it rightly, of course we should be talking about that. Of course we should be talking about the excess of using food or using drink or using parties or using orgies to fulfill our pleasures. Of course we should be talking about that. In fact, if you understand gluttony rightly, you might say, well, we actually do talk a lot about that in our churches. It's not just about gaining too much weight. It's about the idea of the wild partying that goes on along with that. So that's dealing with some of the gluttony passages. Let me now cite 2 passages in the New Testament that I think help us get some sense of where physical health lies on the line of priorities for us as Christians. So the first one is 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And first I'm going to read just kind of the snapshot of this, the part that's sometimes cited, and then I'll read the whole context. So in the middle of this passage, the Apostle Paul says, for physical training is of some value. Now, I remember I went to a Christian college, and at my Christian college, there was one, it wasn't a PE class, but it was kind of a life fitness class that we all had to take. And I remembered our professor having that as sort of a memory verse for us, or a key verse. For physical training is of some value, as if what this verse is saying, or Paul is saying in this verse is, hey, get out there because physical training is valuable. So train yourself physically and eat well and exercise well. Well, let me read the whole context. Verse 7, he says, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. So here's Paul's perspective on basically physical exercise and health. He says, oh yeah, it has some value, but it is dwarfed by the value of focusing your attention on growing in godliness. If you're going to spend some time on weight loss or on getting healthy, yeah, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That has some value, but not nearly as much value as focusing on how you're growing in your discipleship of Jesus, how you're following him, how you're obeying him, how you're training yourself so that your life is focused on what he says is important. Physical training, yeah, it has some value, but not nearly as much value as training for godliness. Now, in a similar vein, Paul also talks about this in 1 Corinthians 6:13. And this is a little bit of a tricky verse because people debate whether Paul is making a statement of truth or quoting the Corinthians. And he says, you say, food for the stomach and stomach for the food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now, here's what I believe is going on in this passage. Paul, the overall passage that he's addressing here is about sexual immorality. In fact, this is the passage where later on in the chapter he says, flee sexual immorality. Now, in this part, what seems to be going on is that the Corinthians had a saying, and their saying was, food for the body and the body for food. And when they said that, they weren't talking about food, they were actually talking about sex. They were saying, hey, if you're hungry, have some food. If you feel like having sex, just have some sex. It's all just, passing things of the body and physicality and just appetites of the body. It's no big deal. And the way that Paul handles that is not to say, hey, wait a second, you guys are wrong. Sex is a big deal and food is a big deal. The way he handles it instead is more to say, hey, you guys are wrong, sex is a big deal. He doesn't spend any time saying, hey, you guys got to watch what you eat and your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, Paul does say in the same book, our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. But in talking about that, the context for the two times that he says that is one time he's talking about sexual immorality, and the other time he's talking about unity within the body instead of divisions. He's not saying everything that we eat, everything that we smoke, everything that we drink, we've got to watch that because our bodies are the temple. He's saying, don't practice sinful attitudes because you are now the reflection of God in the world. So Paul later on in 1 Corinthians 6 says, hey, sex is not like every other sin. Sexual immorality is not like the other sins because it's a sin that has to do with our body, but it's also a sin that has to do with us creating oneness with another person. It's an emotional and physical and spiritual act that we do. Paul doesn't say food is important and sex is important. He says, you say food and sex are both unimportant. I say sex is really important. He seems to brush off the idea that thinking excessively about food or physical health is very important to us. So let me just kind of give where we go from here. So here's some thoughts. If you are overweight, if you're a Christian and you're overweight, here's what I'd say. You get to view that in a way that holds two realities at the same time. Where on the one hand, if you're overweight, it's certainly not great. I mean, there's nothing positive about being overweight other than the fact that you live in a country where that's even possible and you have enough food for that. So it's not good to be overweight. It's also not something that you should devote your life to fixing. Now, if you're severely overweight, you may end up devoting a portion of your time to really focusing on that. And the reason isn't because God says if you're overweight, that's a sin, but because when you're overweight, it limits you. It gives you limitations of things that you'll be able to do for the kingdom, things that you'll be able to do to serve Jesus. If you're drastically overweight, you're going to run out of energy quickly when you're looking to serve Jesus on an orphanage project or by digging a well or by playing with the kids in the Life Kids class. If you're severely overweight, it's just going to limit you in your life. It's going to limit your ability to play with your kids and your grandkids, to give attention to your husband or wife, to read the Bible, to pray, to do all of these different things. So it's not good, but it's not the worst thing in the world. It's not necessarily a result of you sinning. What it may be a result of is at least a couple things. One's more obvious, and one I'd say is often true. So the one that's pretty much always true is that if you're drastically overweight, that does reflect lack of self-control. And the idea of self-control and delayed gratification really is at the center of our Christian faith. We practice delayed gratification because we believe that right now there is a usurper running the world and we are awaiting the true King Jesus to return. We are practicing delayed gratification because we are living for a coming king instead of a current ruler. So delayed gratification is important. Self-control is important. So if you're drastically overweight or if you're looking at yourself and saying, gosh, I just don't say no to myself with food, that does point towards a habit that you want to cultivate. You want to cultivate self-control. It also points towards the fact that I'd say not every time, but often for people who are overweight, that's a way of masking pain or with dealing with emotional issues. Is that you just decide, all right, I'm just going to keep eating. I'm just going to keep eating because that helps me not deal with these things. Say, God has something better for you. God has something superior than just masking pain or dealing with emotional issues through food. So if you're overweight and you're looking at your situation and saying, I need to deal with it, don't think of it as if, well, God's really mad at me that I'm overweight. But instead look at it and say, God has something better for me here, that there's a better reality that he's called me to. Now, let me go to the flip side. If you find yourself preoccupied with how you look physically and how healthy you are physically, I want to say to you, God has something better for you. That's not meant to be the focus of your life. You're focusing your life on something that has some value. Our calling is to follow Jesus, not to focus on something that has some value. And the sad thing is, just as being drastically overweight can really limit you physically and the things that you're able to do, being anorexic or having a eating disorder can also just as real way limit you in what you're able to do and how you're able to serve Jesus. In fact, one of the interesting things is that there's not a lot in the New Testament that says, hey, be careful that you don't get too overweight. But there is a lot in the New Testament that speaks, especially to women, about don't be preoccupied with your appearance. All right, yeah, you want to look nice at that? That's totally fine, but don't be preoccupied with your appearance. Be preoccupied with cultivating the inner beauty. This is something that we're going to talk about as we get into 1 Peter chapter 3 in just a few weeks at LBF Church. We are not called to be obsessed with our bodies, to be obsessed with physical health, to be obsessed with food. That these things are passing away. These things are of just some importance, just enough importance that because we're followers of Jesus and we want to use our energy to serve him, we want to make sure that we're not doing things that are squelching that energy or keeping us from opportunities to serve him more fully. Our calling is to follow Jesus. And so my counsel is try to handle food and try to handle health in a way that accentuates, that exponentially multiplies your opportunities to serve him, not something that takes over your life so that you're more preoccupied with that than with what Jesus is calling you to do. Now, this is a big and maybe for some of you a timely subject, so you may have questions, you may have feedback about that. If that's the case, feel free to go ahead and leave a comment on this entry in our podcast. The way that you get to the video for each episode of the podcast is to go to our website, lbf.church, and just go to the little tab that says blog and podcast over on the feed. You come to it, you can watch the video, and you can comment below. And if you ask a question that we might follow up on later, I'll take that up in an upcoming episode. And you can also download the podcast on iTunes by just searching LBF Church Podcast. If this is a podcast that you listen to and that you benefit from, I'd appreciate it a ton if you just gave a rating or gave a review, because we'd love for the things that we're talking about here to get out to more people, to help them grow more equipped to follow Jesus and to grow in their affections towards Jesus also. But thanks so much for taking the time to watch or to listen. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.